I want to talk to you today quickly about doing snippets for a podcast. Because if you do a podcast, it is something that is worth doing in terms of if you have the longer version of the podcast, you can cut that podcast up into smaller bits which compel people to listen to the longer podcast if they're to hear it. You can see this used by some of the biggest podcasts in the world. At the moment, Joe Rogan is an example, having gone over to Spotify and now has all of his podcasts on Spotify, he'll still have around a 10-minute snippet of that podcast available on YouTube to be able to access that audience. But if, for example, you have an audio podcast and you want to do snippets, you may have come across an app called Headliner, a website called Headliner. And what that does is it takes your snippet, puts a audio visualizer, one of those little waveforms that responds to the audio, and you may have your podcast cover art there and maybe some information about that episode. But I think it's important to note just how many podcasts use that form of snippet. How many podcasts look quite similar in terms of breaking down their podcasts into snippets if they've all used that Headliner app, for example. So I want you to have a bit of a think about how can you differentiate the snippets for your podcast. Obviously, one way that's easy to do that is with video, but not everyone can do video. Not everyone feels comfortable with doing a video for a podcast, and that's okay too. So, for example, another way of doing it is animating your snippets. You see those little TED Ed videos on YouTube and those sorts of things that essentially have an animated video that sits parallel to the audio. So there's many things that we can do to differentiate our snippets in that way, but I think it is such an important thing to think about in terms of how are we able to differentiate our snippets to the point where if someone's scrolling through and may see multiple podcasts, then ours is going to stand out as the one that they should be listening to.